campaign, what it represents, and discuss its relation to the Democratic Party. And then on Sunday again, the next day, from 11 to 1, that is, we will have a debate on intellectuals in the left, featuring intellectuals. And then finally, finally on Sunday, there will be a wrap-up session where we can discuss how can we build an organized revolutionary left in this country that takes into account some of the mistakes, some of the errors and hesitations that we remember from some of our past experiences. So with that crowded agenda in mind, and with an open invitation for all of you to join us the entire weekend to discuss these things together, I want to bring to you Ernest Mandel, who is a Marxist theoretician, a prolific Marxist theoretician, and an active revolutionary socialist. He is the author of over 20 books, including Late Capitalism, and a new book that will be coming out, which is an analysis of Gorbachev and some of the events of perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union. Ernest has been a leader of the Fourth International for over 40 years now. The Fourth International is a world organization of revolutionary socialists who come out of the tradition of Leon Trotsky, the leader of the Russian Revolution, who was hounded out of the Soviet Union by Stalin. This organization that he founded in 1938 has had a continuous existence all over the world ever since then, and Ernest Mandel has been instrumental in building that world organization. So I would like to introduce to you our comrade and our friend, Ernest Mandel.
Dear friends and comrades, May 68 was in the first place the summit up of a worldwide wave of youth radicalization which touched practically every single capitalist country of the world. Its origins came out of many developments in the 60s. Como Joanna mentioned already, the civil rights movement in the United States. There were very powerful anti-imperialist movements against the French colonial war in Algeria, against the Vietnam War. There was the identification with the Cuban Revolution, and especially with Comrade Ernesto Che Guevara. There were forms of challenging bourgeois social relations, bourgeois morality, or we can better say immorality, on many levels, in many fields. All these movements tied together. I don't want to explain as a participant the mechanisms which led to the actual explosion in May 68 in Paris, which involved several countries and which were a remarkable expression of international solidarity and international awareness. One of the leaders of the Paris student movement was a comrade of German origin, Danny Cohn-Bendit, who was accused by the reactionary ideologues and politicians and journalists being one of the conspirators to set off the night of the barricades. He was accused, attacked as being a German Jew, and it was rather warming the heart of any true internationalists when we listened to tens and tens of thousands of people in the streets of Paris chanting, "We are all German Jews," identifying and solidarizing with Red Danny. He's red not only politically, he's red also because he has strikingly red hair. But if we look in a more sober way at the social nature of this huge explosion, in which literally millions of people participated throughout the world, we will see that by and large, certainly in the United States, but also in most of the countries of Europe, the explosion concerned essentially, if not exclusively, youth. You only had this couple of countries, France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, and with a certain delay, Spain and Portugal, where the majority of the working class participated in a challenge to the existing state with which they were confronted, triggered up by this youth radicalization. In France, you had 10 million workers on strike, occupying for most their factories. In Italy, you had 15 million workers on strike in the so-called hot autumn of 1969. In Czechoslovakia, a student political radicalization triggered off through the intermediary of internal differentiation inside the ruling Communist Party, a huge working class upsurge leading to forms of workers' control and self-management being set up in the key factories of the country. In Spain and Portugal, we had a similar fallout several years ago, but that's where this stopped. In the rest of the world, the youth radicalization remained a youth radicalization and did not trigger off huge mobilizations of the working class. And we can draw several conclusions from this fact to understand what would happen afterwards. In the first place, what was significant in this youth radicalization and this challenge against bourgeois values was a very strong, what you could call, immediatist or utopian quality. A little bit like part of the Red Guards in China, the key idea was to have communism immediately, here and now, without any intermediary stage, and to have individual lifestyle and individual way of acting in society determined by that preoccupation. I don't need to explain to you that that was totally utopian. In order to have communist society, not to speak about the communist lifestyle, you need fundamental changes in the economic, social, and political structure. And if you don't have these changes, the rest will not occur, or it will not occur in any durable and collective way. And the fact that the stress was put on individual lifestyle and changes, immediate changes in personal social relations, in the way a person relates to society, in spite, this might look like a paradox, sound like a paradox, but it isn't, in spite of its apparently, seemingly radical nature, it made the majority of the participants of that movement more vulnerable to the forces of integration or reintegration into bourgeois society. And it is a fact that if we make today the balance sheet of what happened to the individual leaders of this movement in many countries, and I think I could give a few examples of the United States too, but you know them better than I do, you will find them today deeply reintegrated in bourgeois society, and even in positions which are not so at the bottom of the social ladder, which are rather at higher rungs of the social ladder. And this is tied to a social phenomenon. This is not a question of personal guilt or personal capitulation, although plays a certain role, I think, in this development. It is linked to a social phenomenon which many of you who are aware of the economic and social dynamics of late capitalism will easily recognize, is to say the opening up of job opportunities, to say it in a rather vulgar way, through the information revolution, through the communication, big development, big growth of the communication industry. There were a lot of very well-paid jobs of rather interesting, let us say, content opening up, and many of the people who were radicals in the late 60s became occupiers of these jobs in the late 70s and the early 80s and made their peace with bourgeois society through that personal transformation. In the United States, this has not taken such an ugly ideological form as it has in Europe. In Europe, it has taken a very ugly ideological form. Many of the most radical, I will come back to their political characterization in a minute, but many of their most radical leaders of that youth movement have been in the forefront of the offensive against not only communism, socialism, Marxism, but I would say science, rationality, and emancipation. They have become the representatives of what is called in France the new philosophers, which are the ideologues of Reagan-type or Thatcher-type political neoconservative forces. Now, this was also triggered off by a political differentiation which we have to understand. While it is true that the radical student movement completely escaped the control of the traditional parties of the left, especially Social Democracy and the CP, it was deeply split in what we could characterize essentially as three main currents: the Maoist current, which was hegemonic, which was a majority, the spontaneist current, and the revolutionary Marxist or Trotskyist current. Now, the Maoists at that time had a tremendous advantage on their side. That advantage was that they referred to a state of 1 billion people, which is not a small thing. The spontaneists had no state they could refer to. The Trotskyists identified a bit with Cuba, but that's a small state compared to China, and even that identification was only partial. The Maoists identified with a very powerful state, which had a very powerful force of attraction on many youth, especially youth of a religious or semi-religious origin, in Southern Europe especially Catholic origin, which just transferred their faith from one God to another. You can't call it otherwise. I have seen myself with my own eyes. It's hard to believe radical Maoist students having in their room in the university a little picture of Chairman Mao, before which a red candle was burning day and night. I mean, you can't have it in a more symbolic and confirmed way, this, let us say, irrational element. The Maoists got their death blow when the Chinese Communist Party swore off the Cultural Revolution, stopped the Cultural Revolution, reversed the Cultural Revolution, reversed the Mao cult. The thing was out. The thing was out. There was no communism realized immediately in China. Nobody seriously could have expected otherwise, but unfortunately tens and tens of thousands of youth did expect otherwise, were completely misled, completely mystified by what was going on in China. And when things became very clear, of course, they got a terrible disappointment, they got a terrible blow in their stomach, so to speak, and this tremendous disappointment played a role in explaining the decline of the revolutionary enthusiasm and conviction of that part of that generation. In addition to this biggest blow, which was what happened in China, there were other blows, which were not small. There was Cambodia, there was Afghanistan, there was the crushing by military coup d'etat of the Solidarność movement in Poland. All that meant that, let us say, faith in an alternative model of society, which was very strong, very powerful amongst the participants of May 68, went out of the window for the overwhelming majority of the participants, of these participants 10 years later. To that you have to add an objective fact of life, which is not of small consequence either, the fact that the working class, which had been by and large on the offensive in the late 60s, early 70s, offensive of which the high point, I'm talking about the working class, I'm not talking about the revolutionary movement in a more general way, but the chronology is not very much changed by that. The high point was the Portuguese Revolution. It was the first time that the concrete possibility of the working class taking power in a Western country was put on the agenda. The defeat of that revolution, coinciding with the first consequences of the economic depression, of massive unemployment, of fear of unemployment, and similar phenomenon, threw the working class on a defensive and again created a big crisis of credibility for any revolutionary project, any project of building an alternative society in the capitalist countries. So, for all these reasons, the wave of May 68 ended. The large majority of those who were Maoists and spontaneists dropped out. The Trotskyists lost also something, but they withstood much better. They are stronger today than they were before May 68. The Maoists are inexistent. The spontaneists are inexistent. And we have to understand, I say that just in passing, not to gloat on it, on the contrary, to regret it very deeply. We have to understand that the revolutionary tendencies, the revolutionary organizations, and they were genuinely revolutionary as for the motivation of their members. I don't speak about their politics, that's another story. But the individual motivation was certainly revolutionary. Revolutionary organizations thrown up by May 68 were very large. They were not small grouplets of a couple of tens or a couple of 100 people. Only in Europe, they probably went much beyond the 100,000 mark. In Japan, 20, 25,000, if not more. If you add the United States and some Latin American countries to that list, you get near the 200,000 mark. That's not a small number of people. The tragedy is, and this is a political lesson to be drawn from that experience, is that the overwhelming majority of these people today are out of not only revolutionary politics, but politics altogether. out. They have reprivatized, as the saying goes, and this privatization, I have tried to explain its social and its political background. That meant that those who remained revolutionary after May 68 and after the failure of May 68, the failure to change society in a radical way. I don't say that May 68 didn't achieve something, it achieved many things. Many things have been changed at the level of the universities, many things have been changed through an increased interest in Marxism, that continues. There you have, I would say, a permanent capital which has been built up. You have today hundreds of universities throughout the world in which there are people teaching Marxism, as I do in my university, who are ex-veterans, veterans of May 68, ex-students or people who were actively engaged in the May 68 struggle. So that has not been lost. And the consequences of that, from a long-term point of view, are extremely important, should not be underestimated, undervalued in any way. But by and large, the movement failed in its, let us say, deepest expectations of achieving in a rapid way a radical change in society. That did not occur anywhere. And as it linked up with a retreat or a turn towards defensive struggles of the working class, this meant that even those who remained in the revolutionary organizations went through difficult times. I don't need to explain that to American friends and comrades. You are probably one of the worst situations in the world from that point of view. But the period 1976, the decade 1976-1985 was not the nicest period in world history, to say the least. After the victory of the Nicaraguan revolution, there have been no new revolutionary victories, and there have been a lot of blows and a lot of defeats of mass forces, socialist forces, working class forces throughout the world. Now, the way I see things is that this is changing now, and that the worst moment is over, and that there is today a significant upturn, not yet of the same scope and the same importance of May 68, but there is a significant upturn of mass activity throughout the world, in some key countries and some smaller countries. And we can recognize this at two different levels, and there we see already an important advance compared with May 68. On the one hand, there are what is called sociological formula, which one can discuss, new social movements. Essentially the environmental movement, the anti-nuclear movement, the new youth radicalization, anti-war movement directed against nuclear weapons, but generally against the militarization of Western society throughout the capitalist world. These movements, some people call them petit bourgeois, which is nonsense. From a social point of view, I don't want to discuss the political aspect of it, but socially it is nonsense. The overwhelming majority of participants in these movements are wage earners, are people who are unemployed, but they are part of the wage earning class, of course, for the very simple reason that they concern the key imperialist countries and some of the most important semi-industrialized capitalist countries. And in these countries, the wage-earning class represents the overwhelming majority of the active population, and you can't have huge mass movements which are outside this wage-earning class. Just to give you an example of the amplitude of these movements, in countries like Holland, Belgium, West Germany, the mobilizations against the NATO new nuclear rockets involved millions of people. In my own country, you had the largest demonstration in Belgian history of over 500,000 people. In Holland, you had the largest manifestation in Dutch history of over 500,000 people. In West Germany, several millions of people participated in these demonstrations, and it is just impossible from a social point of view to have such huge demonstrations composed essentially by non-wage earners or non-unemployed, but I repeat, the unemployed are part of the proletariat of the wage-earning class. That's just impossible in these countries in which the wage earners represent between 80 and 90% of the population, of the active population of these countries. These movements are extremely positive, extremely progressive, but they are, of course, single-issue movements. That's the difference with May 68. While they are larger, much larger in numbers than the people who were mobilized in May 68, they are much less radical as to their general demands. Their general demands are generally tied to one or two immediate issues. I wouldn't say that they are unpolitical, as certain commentators have said. That is absolutely untrue. I will give another example there. We had in France, in the end of '86, the largest new student mobilization of the last decade, in which 1 million high school students and university students participated. This is described by many journalists and commentators as a purely cooperative movement tuned to demands of easier entry into the university, say purely, if you want to say, professional, between inverted commas, demands for students. This is absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. This movement raised 2 or 3 key political slogans against state repression, against discrimination against the immigrant workers, and against racist or semi-racist legislation prepared by the conservative government in France in relation with youth of Arab, North African, and African origin. These demands were not at all apolitical. They were highly political and highly radical political. If you think that 1 million people mobilized for these demands, that's not a small thing in a country which has today a conservative government and conservative ideology prevailing. But they are still partial demands. They did not go towards a general questioning of bourgeois society and of the bourgeois state order, as did May 68. That is, they were, as the saying goes, pragmatic, practical, concrete. They wanted some changes, not a total change, but some radical changes here and now, some of which they achieved. They brought, amongst other things, the fall of the Minister of Education, who had started to introduce some of these anti-student, anti-democratic legislation for the way in which universities and high schools are being run. Now, besides these new social movements, we have an upsurge of working class struggles in a series of countries, upsurge of working class struggles which has still by and large a defensive nature, but which goes one important step further than the worker struggles which we had in '68 and '69 in France and Italy. In France and Italy, the worker struggles of '68-'69, contrary to what happened in the youth movement, were generally still controlled by the traditional organizations of the working class, in the first place by the Communist Party and the trade unions run by the Communist Party. It is true that that was more true in France than in Italy. In Italy, the workers created at factory level factory committees, which were in reality committees of trade union unity, trying to overcome and successfully overcome the split of the Italian trade union movement between four different federations, which were each of them tied to different political parties. The workers felt a very strong need of unity. They threw up these factory committees, which were generally elected by universal franchise in the large factories of North and Central Italy, which were then recognized by the trade unions, but the Italian CP, which is very flexible, had a very clever maneuverist leadership, succeeded. I again say by and large, all this is set in much too crude and absolute a manner. Things were more complex than that, but if you make the historical balance sheet afterwards, by and large, the CP bureaucracy maintained its grip over this movement. In the present wave of still defensive worker struggles, something similar is happening in the working class of key European countries. What is happening in the new social movements? Each of these successive big strikes escapes the control of the traditional social democratic, trade union, and CP bureaucracy, and throws up new leaderships which are genuine working class leaderships. I don't say revolutionary ones, I say genuine in the sense as they are more or less democratically elected by the bulk of the strikers and lead to the appearance and extension of organs of self-organization of the workers, not workers' councils, not Soviets, nothing of such a radical way, strike leadership, strike committees, but genuinely elected and representative of the overwhelming majority of the workers, and in the same time, because there the workers showed the same sense of realism and of, let us say, pragmatism, as does the new generation of radicalized youth, not at all in ultra-left anti-union way, no, recognizing the union structure as a permanent structure, trying to relate to the union structure, not challenging the unions as such, but operating with a qualitatively higher level of workers' democracy and workers' self-organization. The largest example which we have had of this is in Italy again, where practically every single strike in the last 12 months has been led by committees of that type. Trade union bureaucracy is very worried as a result of this. In Spain, it doesn't go as far as that yet, but we have had several important strikes, the last one being the national strike of the bank employees and the bank workers, which threw up a structure of the same type. In France, we have had a similar development with the railway workers' strike at the end of 1986, which was led throughout by a coordinating committee, or better said, two national coordinating committees, democratically elected by strike committees in every single railway station participating in that strike. In Denmark, we have had two general strikes which were led in a similar way. And in my own country, in Belgium, we have had in several towns, not on a nationwide scale yet, but in several of the key industrial towns of the country, especially in my hometown of Antwerp, which is today the main industrial town of the country, a similar development with a democratically elected Central Strike Committee, completely integrated into the trade unions and recognized by the unions, but democratically elected by the workers themselves, which led the strike from the beginning till the end. And of which, I might say, in passing, a comrade of my organization, member of the Central Committee of my party, and candidate in the general elections for my party was the chairman. Now, if we try to understand what are the importance, the most important aspects of this new radicalization and what are its limitations, we have to operate with two key notions. The notion of a process of fundamental recomposition of the labor movement, which is now underway in a whole series of important countries of the world, and the process and a phenomenon of what I would call intermediary consciousness, an intermediate stage of consciousness between classical reformism and Stalinism on the one hand, and revolutionary Marxism, or let us say class consciousness at its highest level on the other hand. Let us first take the recomposition of the international labor movement. This is a spectacular phenomenon. Spectacular phenomenon in a dozen countries, if we want to call it like that, but not small countries, and many of them very, very important countries, and which has happened, one can say, with a rhythm, with a rapidity, which nobody, even amongst the most optimistic revolutionists, could have expected a few years ago. The most striking example is the example of Brazil, where after the downfall of the military dictatorship, Brazil is the most industrialized country of Latin America, and today country which is the 6th or 7th place in the world as to the number of wage earners and of industrial wage earners. São Paulo, the industrial capital of Brazil, is the largest proletarian city in the world, the city in which you have the largest number of wage earners, industrial wage earners of any city. You have more there than you have in New York or than you have in Moscow. Well, in this working class, after the downfall of the military dictatorship, in a couple of years' time, has organized a new trade union federation, which has between 2 and 3 million members, and a political party, for the first time in the Brazilian history, an independent political party of the working class, the Workers' Party, which has 350,000 members, and which got at the last general elections 6 to 7% of the popular vote, and whom most of the people predict will get nearly 10% of the popular vote at the next general election. This is a completely new development. It's one of the most exciting changes in the world situation which has occurred in the last 20, 30, 40 years. It involves, I repeat, a key working class of the world. And if you look at the organizational structure of the Workers' Party and of the Brazilian Trade Union Federation, you will be struck by the confirmation of what I said before. I mean, this new labor movement, you can't call it otherwise, is completely democratic. It has written the right of tendency and of faction into its statutes. It is based on the key idea of self-organization of the working class. And it has a program that doesn't mean so much because the program for the time being is still on paper, but it has a program which comes out openly for socialist revolution. The fact that 350,000 organized workers leading a trade union of several millions in a key country of the world like Brazil openly claim to stand for socialist revolution, that's the word they use, is not a small fact. That's the least one can say. This gives you an indication of what this recomposition of the international labor movement is all about. I would not call the Workers' Party a revolutionary party. I would say it is a socialist party, which could become, in totality or part of it, a revolutionary party, which could also split somewhere in its history as the classical socialist parties before the First World War split. Nobody knows what's going to happen. That will depend on many things. But the one thing I can assure you of, I've just come back from there, and I witnessed that with my own eyes. The thing I can assure you of is that the revolutionary Marxists can operate in that party really like fish in the water. They are at home there. They are recognized there. They are respected there. They are accepted there by everybody. There was not a single town in which I spoke as an official representative of the Fourth International, and I spoke in many, where at the platform was not sitting the local chairman of the trade unions, the local chairman of the Workers' Party, one or the leader of the parliamentary faction of the Workers' Party in that state, and many of these towns were towns where these comrades themselves, at least some of them, were members of the Fourth International. There is a second example, which one would quote, which is not exactly the same, but which is also a striking confirmation of what is turning, what is changing, what is developing positively in the international labor movement. This is the emergence of mass unionization in South Africa. The South African black working class was the most oppressed and exploited in the world. Wages of a black worker in South Africa were below 10%, I repeat, below 10% of the average wage of a white worker. These brothers and sisters of ours had no political right, no citizen right. They were aliens in their own country. They were the most haunted, oppressed people in the world. Within a couple of years' time, in a completely unexpected way, nobody, especially not the white rulers of South Africa, but nobody expected a thing like that to happen. Nearly 1.5 million of these comrades have organized in new mass unions, which have completely changed the political situation in that country by one blow. You can repress, you can kill hundreds of national liberation militants. You cannot destroy the working class if it is self-organized. If you destroy the working class, you stop your own ruling class of getting rich and of functioning. You have no more gold, no more diamonds, no more electrical currents, no more housemaids, because these fools, these racist fools who consider the blacks inferior, give all their children to black women to be reared. I mean, the whole thing is completely irrational and crazy, but the reality of it has now asserted itself on an organizational field. And once these unions were built, again, on a self-organized, on the basis of self-organization of the working class, with shop stewards in every mine and every factory being ready to replace each other. You can arrest 100, you can arrest 200, you can arrest 500, you can arrest 1,000. There are always new who come up and replace those who are arrested. Repression stacks a wall, which it had not stuck during the previous 50 years, and something radical is changing. I don't say that the South African black working class is at the eve of a victory and of destroying the racist, semi-fascist apartheid regime. Things are not as exciting as that, but they're already exciting enough when you see the amount, the scope of the struggle which is going on, and when you see what power this new working class movement can yield once it sees the strength of democratic mass self-organization. And I think our brothers and sisters in the occupied territories by the Zionist state of Palestine are starting a similar experience today. They are going in the similar road, they are learning similar lessons, and they will come to similar successes. I don't say a final victory, that's still far before us, but at least similar partial successes of those which I just indicated. The broadest of these examples of new mass organization, completely new, escaping any control by the old bureaucratic apparatuses, is the example of Poland, where in a very short period of time, 10 million workers were organized in a new trade union, Solidarność, which was much more than a trade union, which implied political activity, educational activity of a democratic nature, as hardly any European country has ever known after the 1918-1923 period, with the possible exception of Spain in 1936. Thousands and thousands of independent newspapers, pamphlets published by illegal publishing houses, flying universities, workers' courses in factories, an idea which, just in passing, comes from Rosa Luxemburg and was tried on a very small scale during the 1905-1906 revolution, and was now applied on 100 times broader scale by the Polish workers. All these phenomena confirmed the nature of this new working class movement, very, very much more progressive than what we have seen in the traditionally led, bureaucratically led, social democratic, Stalinist and post-Stalinist mass organizations of the last 30, 40 years. I could also quote, although this is still more modest, more limited, but it is extremely impressive also, the success of our Mexican comrades of the PRT, of the Revolutionary Workers' Party, in building a mass base outside of the electoral success they have had, but a mass base based on direct action amongst the peasants, amongst trade unionist workers, amongst especially the inhabitants of the poor neighborhoods, the marginalized population of the poor neighborhoods of the large Mexican cities, and starting a historical struggle for the political independence of the working class in the second largest Latin American country after the breakthrough in Brazil, together with the example of Brazil, will be an inspiration for the working class of Argentina, the third largest Latin American country, probably with the most militant working class, but where this trade union militancy has not yet found its expression in political independence of the working class. Historically, the experience of the Sandinista comrades in Nicaragua is part of the same historical trend, because in Nicaragua you had traditional small Stalinist organization, you had a traditional Maoist organization, which the Sandinista comrades, in leading a victorious socialist revolution, completely bypassed, eliminated as a significant political force, not through terror, in no way whatsoever, and giving the first example of a worker state in which a qualitatively higher degree of political democracy, of political pluralism was integrated, not for reasons of convenience, as some people think, and not as transitional measures, but for reasons of deep political, programmatic conviction, as you can find in the key programmatic documents of some of the leaders of that revolution, which express that very big step forward of communist thinking, which brings them much nearer to the programmatic positions of the Fourth International on that key question of self-organization and proletarian democracy. But we go now to the other side of the coin. We see now the other aspect of this exciting change in the situation of the international labor movement, we look at what happens at the level of consciousness. And there, of course, the situation is not so clear and not so positive as it is at the level of self-organization. With the partial exception of the Brazilian Workers' Party, none of the forces which are, and of course the exception of our comrades of the Mexican PRT, none of the forces which I have enumerated have clarity on some key programmatic issues. If they advance some solutions, they are generally partial solutions, and some of them don't advance even these. They reflect the same, let us say, pragmatic, matter-of-fact, concrete approach which characterizes large part of the mass participants in the movements which I have previously enumerated. They do not like too much general ideas. They do not like too much general programs. They do not like too much general perspectives. They stick to the immediate. They stick to the concrete. Now, some of you might think that that is a big advantage compared with false generalizations, false programs, and false perspectives, as obviously were encountered by many of the participants of May 68. I personally prefer people who don't shout long life for anybody to people who shout long life to Chairman Mao, because that turned out to be a disastrous historical mistake. That people want to avoid such historical mistakes is logical. I don't have any objection to that. Nevertheless, I am quite convinced, and history confirms this, that the lack of generalization, the lack of general program, the lack of a concrete model of a more humane socialist society is not an advantage but a disadvantage, because you will not make a socialist revolution without hardly trying. That does not occur like that in history. It hasn't in the past, and it will not in the future. So if you have no idea whatsoever about socialist revolution, you will just not make one, full stop. And if you don't make one, well, then we are in deep trouble, as I will explain in a minute, but I suppose most of you agree with me on that. So the fact that we have this intermediary stage of consciousness, that revolutionary Marxists and other revolutionists are generally accepted in this new labor movement, in this new mass movement, but accepted as good mass leaders, as good strike leaders, as good fighters for immediate issue, not as representatives of an alternative solution to the crisis of the present world. This is a very big weakness of this movement, not a source of strength, not at all. It is a weakness. And if we don't fight to overcome that weakness, this weakness will assert itself more and more in the next stage or stages of the struggle. Why? Because this new labor movement, this process of recomposition of the international labor movement, these new social movements, with their tremendous mass amplitude and mass scope, are facing a terrible world. They are facing a world in which the crisis of capitalism becomes worse and worse, with terrifying implications. They are facing a world in which the crisis of Soviet society is very grave, very deep. I don't say with terrifying consequences, but with consequences which are not positive at all for the mass of the Soviet people, which means to say that hundreds of millions of people in the world are faced today with the concrete perspective and risk of a serious deterioration of their material and social living conditions. In some third world countries, this means starvation in the literal sense of the word. If you lower the standard of living of the Western proletariat, of the Soviet proletariat, by 10%, people do not starve. They are worse off, but they don't starve. If you lower the standard of living of a Honduras, of a San Salvador, of a Chad, of a Senegal, of a Bangladesh worker by 40 or 50%, you push down, Bolivian or Peruvian worker, you push down his intake, daily intake of calories to the level of an inmate of a German concentration camp of 1940. Exactly that, 1600 calories. I mean, this is a concrete perspective of mass starvation, mass hunger. I don't need to repeat here what is generally known but accepted in a rather inhuman and cynical way by large part of the Western population, that literally millions of children die every year. More have died in the last 10 years than there were deaths in the whole Second World War as the result of malnutrition or as the result of the lack of elementary pharmaceutical goods, which could be solved in less than a year's time by a redistribution of resources on a world scale, but nobody does anything about it. And this is just a symbol of the terrible ills which this crisis of capitalism will impose more and more on higher and higher fractions, larger and larger fractions of mankind. There is the danger that as the result of this crisis, which has no way, it has absolutely no way of being solved in any normal manner in a foreseeable future, that this crisis will have even more terrifying implications as the result of a continuous build-up of military expenditure, which is the classical way out of a deep depression for capitalism. Logically, a third world war is no solution for capitalism. Obviously not. Third world war, even if you abolish all nuclear weapons, only with the existing nuclear power plants which today exist in the world, and which would be blown up by normal bombs, not nuclear bombs, you destroy human civilization, if not human life on Earth. So that's no solution of capitalism, for capitalism. Non-existing capitalists selling non-existent commodities to non-existing buyers is of course no solution. So logically, rationally, one would say this will not occur. This will not occur, provided that capitalists continue to be ruled by rational forces. But we have had in the past at least one example, if not more than one, of totally irrational adventurers ruling large capitalist countries. I'm talking about Hitler in Germany. Way in which Hitler behaved at the end of his life, I don't say in the beginning of his rule, but at the end of his life was totally irrational, even from the point of view of his own class. He proposed to blow up all German factories. Well, that was not rational from the point of view of the German capitalists, to blow up all their property. It didn't happen. It didn't happen, which is indicating of who ruled really Germany, this dictator or the capitalist. But he proposed it. He proposed it. If he would have had nuclear weapons, he would certainly have used them, including on the territory of his own country. Totally irrational person at the end of his life. So that we can come to this terrifying conclusion that if by any chance or accident working class forces and their allies are defeated in some key capitalist country by forces of the extreme right and similar types as Hitler, not necessarily open fascists, you can have all kinds of vermin of that type which is not openly fascist, take over, they could blow up the world. They could realize this madman's slogan, better dead than red. They wouldn't apply it only to themselves. They would apply it to the whole of mankind. I say you don't need people who are openly fascist to do that. I'll just cite to you an example of Brazil. Brazilian left has published a year ago a book which was inspired by a similar book published in Argentina, Nunca Más, Never Again, in which all the tortures and crimes of the military dictatorship were denounced, which were horrible crimes, in which tens of thousands of people were killed. And those who were responsible for these crimes have answered with an unbelievable book, high officers of the army, a book entitled Brazil Forever, Brazil Sempre, in which they not only defend the use of torture and mass killings, but in which they say we will do it again after their defeat or partial defeat when the military dictatorship was overthrown. So this indicates to you the state of mind of a certain number of cohabitants of this planet of ours, which makes the perspective of a continuation of capitalist rule for another 20, 30 or 40 years, not to put too fine and too narrow a time limit on the phenomenon, rather terrifying. That's the least one can say. Now, in Soviet society, we are witnessing a different type of crisis, but a very deep crisis too. I have no time to go into the details of the subject. This would be subject of another lecture. I cannot do that this evening without tiring and the listeners and even the speaker. But I can assure you that the revelations which have been made by the official leaders of the Soviet Union during the last 24 months about the social reality of their country goes far beyond, is far harsher, and reveals a picture much worse than the most radical left critics of Soviet society in the West have drafted during the last 30 years. Outside of the fact, I just say it in passing, that they now officially state that 13 million people were killed by Stalin, 13 million people in the purges of the 30s, of which more than 1 million communists, the absolute majority of the members of the Communist Party up to 1932. Outside of that fact, I just quote two facts to you, which are out of official Soviet documents. 50 million people in the Soviet Union are considered poor in the sense that they have a monthly income which is 25% of the average worker's wage. 50 million people live with 25% of an average worker's wage. This is what one bureaucrat pays for one large banquet. For one large banquet, he pays as much as the monthly income of 50 million people. You can imagine how these poor people, not to speak about a large part of the working class, hate these bureaucrats. That's the conclusion which anybody would draw from such a picture. I give you a second fact, which is as terrible as the first one. The Soviet Union is the only country in the world, except perhaps some of the poorest African countries, but even there I'm not sure, where infantile mortality increased uninterruptedly for 15 successive years. These are the official statistics of the Soviet government today. And that reached a point where this infantile mortality was nearly equal in the Soviet Union, which is the second largest industrial country in the world, to its level in China, which is one of the poorest countries of the world, not to speak about Cuba, but it is much, much lower, much, much lower. This was, of course, a disastrous development, and there is absolutely no doubt that anybody in his right mind, including a large part of the bureaucracy, was convinced that that had to stop. If that would not stop these negative developments, the Soviet Union would become a second-rate power from every point of view, including military point of view, because the idea that you can have a country in which you have the most advanced military establishment linked up with a very backward and declining technology and social welfare, that's just nonsense. That's impossible. You can't do it. It's irrealizable. So in that sense, perestroika, the push towards radical reforms, self-reform of the bureaucracy, was the inevitable result of these objective contradictions. But you had another aspect of social reality in the Soviet Union, where you can say, in the first aspect, this seems to confirm the negative view of many anti-communists and many anti-socialists in the West. But now comes the other side of the coin here too. You had another aspect of Soviet reality, which probably outside of my own tendency, nobody really understood, and which we have foreseen, and against seemingly all evidence stuck to consistently and obstinately for years. At the same time, there was building up in Soviet society the beginning of a social awakening, the beginning of a social awareness, the beginning of a rebirth of public opinion, the beginning of independent critical thought and activity by important sectors of the intelligentsia, of the youth, and part of the working class, women, oppressed nationalities, and so on and so forth, which created an objective dynamic, even more dangerous for bureaucratic rule than this material crisis which I mentioned before. People were aware what was happening in that country, and they couldn't not be aware, because these people are very cultivated, very well educated people. That was the point which we have been making for many, many years. There is no comparison between the Russian working class of today and the Russian working class of 1917 or of 1937. This is the strongest and most skilled, best educated working class in the world. 125 million wage earners, 40% of which have higher education, either technological education or university education. You have no place in the West anything similar to that. These people read, devour books, magazines, about literature, about sociology on a scale which is unknown in the West. Theoretical magazines in that country are read and sold by the hundreds of thousands of copies. They disappear 24 hours or 36 hours after they appear. You have nowhere in the West something similar of that type. And that such a working class, losing fear of repression, no more terrorized as it was in the time of Stalin and immediately afterwards, would overcome, perhaps slowly, perhaps in a contradictory way, perhaps not with clear communist consciousness, but overcome, yes, its state of political paralysis and atomization that was absolutely unavoidable. So it's these two ignition keys, these two sparks which explain what is happening today in the Soviet Union. It's not Gorbachev who has initiated any of these fundamental movements. Gorbachev is the product of these fundamental movements, and in a certain sense he accelerates them, but in a certain sense he also creates new obstacles for them. Glasnost, which means, if you want to cut through all the cant, initial democratization of intellectual, political, and factory life, the possibility for the masses to speak out without fear of immediate repression, I would say, is positive. No serious socialist in the world could oppose glasnost. To say that it only interests the intellectuals is nonsense. I repeat, in a country where you have 125 million wage earners, to think that they will not take the opportunity of speaking out, which is offered to them, the broader terrain, area of freedom which is opened for them, the capacity to voice their demands, their own demands, not the demands of Gorbachev, their own demands, that would be complete underestimation of the potential of that working class. And that has started. That has already started, and that's, of course, a tremendous change in the world situation. I repeat, this is the strongest working class in the world. It would be exactly the same as if it happened in America, that you would have dozens and dozens of strikes, throwing up elected strike committees with concrete demands, and demands which go very far, which are not only demands of more wages, or of more equality, or of better food supply, or better houses. No, which concern workers' control, very immediately, very directly, which say if you want us to take responsibility and pay the costs for what happens in the factories, we want power to decide. That's not a small thing. In a country where you do not have the obstacle anymore of private property and private bosses on the road of self-organization and self-administration of the working class. So I would say glasnost is positive. We have to support it. We have to push it forward. We have to extend it as much as possible, eliminate all the restrictions, or demand that should be eliminated, all the restrictions on it. It's nothing but good which could come out of it, because only people who completely underestimate and despise the working class could believe that against 125 million workers who would be free to state and fight for their demands, a couple of million of capitalist roders, to quote the Maoist or ex-Maoist formula of yesterday, could avail. I mean, this is foolish. It's absolute misunderstanding of the social relationship of forces in a country like the Soviet Union. Perestroika, that's another kettle of fish. Perestroika means reorganization of the economic system, of management, reorganization of the way in which the factories are run, which tilts the machine in favor of the managers, in favor of the, let us say, technocratic wing of the bureaucracy, with implications which are grave for the key conquest of the Soviet working class, which still survives, which is full employment. If all the perestroika plans are realized, you would have the layoff of between 10 and 15 million workers from the factories, so-called inefficient factories. You would have bankruptcy of many of these factories, and so on and so forth. So you have an evident conflict between glasnost and perestroika. The more rights and freedoms the workers have, the more they will use these rights and freedoms to oppose any economic measure which goes against their direct immediate interests. I do not say that all the measures of perestroika are anti-working class. That would be an exaggeration. The workers would be very happy if their situation would be better from the point of view of provision of food, high quality food, building of houses, and many other things like that. There they would accept. but they would not accept layoffs, they would not accept rights to layoffs by managers, they would not accept increased inequality of wages and incomes, they would not accept the breakup of the close ties of solidarity at shop floor level, which they have woven during the last 20 years. And because there is a very evident conflict between the dynamic of glasnost and the dynamic of perestroika, my prediction is that the majority of the bureaucracy will try to stop glasnost in order to realize perestroika, and that very deep conflicts will undermine the Gorbachev regime in the rather near future. It will not outlast a very long period of time, but I would add, you will not have a return to Stalinist type of repression, and you will not have a return to Brezhnevite type of stagnation. For that, too many forces, too large forces have been put in motion, and you will have probably a continuation of the growth of independent working class activity and of self-organization of the working class, which is for us the key feature of what is happening and changing today in the Soviet Union. You can summarize the contradictions of these two crises, crisis of capitalism and the crisis of Soviet society, two different crises but parallel and intertwined, by a phenomenon which is today perhaps more sensitive to an economist or somebody who has given much energy and much effort to the defense of the Marxist economic theory, as I am, than to other comrades or other people, but which seems nearly unbelievable. At the very moment in which the virtues of market economy are deeply questioned today in the West as the result of the stock market crash, which will continue and which will lead to a very, very deep economic recession in the coming months, at the very moment when in the West this neoliberal creed is rejected by a significant faction of the bourgeois class and its ideologues, and when from that point of view Reagan is defeated, even before the coming American elections, at this very moment, amongst so-called socialists and communists, all their hope is placed in market economy and market values. You do not find a single social democratic or communist party today in Europe, West and East, which does not call for more market economy. And the same thing is, of course, true in China too. This sounds completely unreal, out of this world. When you see the failure of market economy in the West, 40 million unemployed, only in the imperialist countries, several hundreds of millions of unemployed in the third world, tremendous increase in poverty, and all the other things I've spoken about. At this very moment, you have all the representatives of the traditional working class parties who are kneeling before the golden calf and kneeling before market economy and market value. Well, I can tell you one thing, the workers will not follow them. And that's one of the reasons of my optimism. That's one of the reasons why I say that this old, traditional, bureaucratized labor movement is on the way out internationally, not only in the countries which I've enumerated, internationally, because there is too big a gap now between what these comrades, if we can call them like that, stand for and what is happening in the real world. The gap has become too big. And that's why I think that we have, when I say we, I do not speak only for my chapel and for my current and my organization, but we in the sense of all socialists, all revolutionists in the world, that we have larger opportunities today coming in some countries already existing, in other countries like the United States coming to us in the coming years than we ever had before. Because the terrain is now free from many of the obstacles which were formidable in the 40s, 50s and 60s, still in May 68, as I indicated it before, but these obstacles are being eliminated now by the march of events themselves. There is no better way to demonstrate that. And to end on an optimistic note, this conference this evening, begin your conference on an optimistic note, than to underline the historical importance, the tremendous importance of the victory which we just scored a couple of weeks ago when Comrade Bukharin, ex-chairman of the Communist International, Comrade Rykov, ex-chairman of the Council of Commissars of the Soviet Union, Comrade Rakovsky, closest lieutenant of Comrade Trotsky, were officially rehabilitated by the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union. And when that Supreme Court said that all the slanderous, treacherous, murderous accusations directed against these comrades were false from the beginning to the end, and that all the confessions extorted from these comrades during these Moscow trials were extorted by torture, by inhuman torture applied to them. This rehabilitation implies de facto, if not de jure, a rehabilitation of Comrade Trotsky himself. Because if you read the verdict of the third Moscow trial, you will see that in every single paragraph of this verdict, the enemy of the people, Leon Davidovich Bronstein, called Trotsky, is said to be responsible for the alleged crimes committed by the defendants of that trial, crimes which they never committed, which were inventions, slanderous inventions from the beginning to the end. At the end of this rehabilitation, we have, of course, the duty to continue the fight for the formal rehabilitation of the defendants of the first and the second Moscow trial, and of Comrade Trotsky and Comrade Sedov himself. But we have especially to understand what this means, what tremendous historical lesson we have to draw from this. There you had the most powerful state machine in the world, supporting itself on a political police and mass torturers counted by the hundreds of thousands, supported by a servile state apparatus, big, well-known intellectuals throughout the world of hundreds of thousands, producing tens of millions of books, articles, defending these slanders, killing millions of people, all to no avail. All to no avail. Historical truth has triumphed. Historical truth has affirmed itself, as Comrade Trotsky was absolutely convicted since the first day of these trials that it would. And those who committed these crimes, those who condoned these crimes, those who lied to the people of the world and the workers of the world about these crimes, they stand today exposed as mass murderers of communists, accomplices of mass murders of communists, and apologists of mass murders of communists. And that small band, very small and isolated band of honest communists, honest socialists, honest humanists, who fought against these lies and these slanders from the beginning, stand completely vindicated, can prove today that they are the only current of the international working class movement who has no blood on his hands, who have no stain on their banners, who have defended principles, who have defended proletarian democracy and morality at tremendous costs, but with a final political triumph which indicates that in the long run it pays to stick to principles, it pays to stick to truth, it pays to stick to the basic historical interests of the working class. Therefore, I say to you, comrades, lift up your heads and your hearts. The future is ours, because the future is for the international working class. The future is for workers' power. The future is for international socialism. The future is for world socialist revolution.